Okay, this is the second attempt. I did the whole thing and I didn't record it. I already showed it. Imagine waking up one day to discover that the government has decided your constitutional rights mean something entirely different from what they were intended or have been since the founding of our country. Imagine a group of people who have taken certain words and phrases out of their original context and have distorted its meaning in order to limit your First Amendment rights to free speech, freedom of religion, or perhaps your Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendment rights to due process. This is the current reality surrounding the Second Amendment, and the misinterpretation is caused by confusion, political rhetoric, and lack of civic education. As an American citizen who is a supporter of the original intent of the Constitution and strong believer in the Bill of Rights, I consider this issue deeply personal and relevant to us all. As a Second Amendment enthusiast and someone who regularly studies firearm history and laws, I have read the arguments behind landmark decisions like District of Columbia v. Heller and frequently witness how the Second Amendment is often misunderstood. And while there are many common misconceptions and incorrect statements about the Second Amendment, my main point today will be that the U.S. government, courts, and educational institutions should reaffirm and teach that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms that is independent of the militia. First, I will explain the problem of widespread misunderstanding about the Second Amendment. Next, I will present solutions that reaffirm and accurately teach the true meaning of the Second Amendment. And like I just mentioned, many citizens and politicians and educators incorrectly believe the Second Amendment only applies to organized militias. According to the book Public Opinion and Constitutional Controversy by Nathaniel Persuasive, who is a leading constitutional scholar and political scientist at Columbia Law School, in a national survey, quote, almost as many as 72% believe the Second Amendment gives individuals the right to own guns, while 25% say the amendment is confined to forming a militia, end quote. This means a significant portion of the public still incorrectly believes the Second Amendment only applies to collective militia rights and not individual citizens' rights to the Second Amendment. When the public misunderstands the Second Amendment, it opens the door for restrictive laws that conflict with the history and tradition of the constitutional text and the precedent set by Supreme Court. This confusion has real consequences on policy debates, voting behavior, and proposed legislation. To understand how this misunderstanding continues today, we must look at some of its root causes. Cause number one, historical and linguistic confusion around the phrase well-regulated militia. The phrase well-regulated militia is often taken out of its 18th century context, leading to incorrect interpretation. As we all know, language is constantly evolving and words often gain or lose meaning over time. This is why it's important to understand and interpret words by their appropriate cultural and historical context. Words mean what they mean at the time they were written. In District of Columbia v. Heller, Justice Antonin Scalia explains that in the 18th century, well-regulated meant well-trained and disciplined, not controlled or restricted. In the 1700s, well-regulated referred to something being properly functioning, not government-controlled. He states, quote, the adjective well-regulated implies nothing more than the imposition of proper discipline and training, end quote. Another example which further proves this point can be found in a CNN publication which documents an interview between Jeffrey Rosen, who is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and Jack Rakov, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and professor of political science at law at Stanford. When asked what did it mean to be well-regulated, Rakov replied, quote, well-regulated in the 18th century tended to be something like well-organized, well-armed, well-disciplined, end quote. He also adds, quote, it didn't mean regulation in the sense that we use it now. in that it is not about the regulatory state, end quote. A contemporary example of the proper use of this phrase is a clock or pocket watch could be said to be well regulated if it was functioning as expected, calibrated, and in working order. Saying a clock is well regulated did not mean the clock or watch was regulated by the government, because modern audiences misinterpret 18th century wording. They misunderstand the amendment's original meaning and intent. Cause number 2. Misinterpretation of the phrase the right of the people. Another cause for confusion is not understanding the phrase the right of the people is used throughout the Constitution. This phrase appears a total of 3 times in the Bill of Rights. It is found in the First, Second, and Fourth Amendments, and each time it unambiguously refers to individual rights, not collective rights. Collective rights are those that can be only exercised through participation in a corporate body, such as a militia. And because we know the First and Fourth Amendments are individual rights, then we can logically conclude the Second Amendment was likely meant to be an individual right as well. Furthermore, when the Constitution mentions the people, it is not referring to subsets of people, such as in a militia, but the whole body of people who comprise the entirety of its citizenry. In the majority opinion of D.C. v. Heller, Justice Scalia states, quote, "The unamended Constitution and the Bill of Rights uses the phrase rights of the people 2 other times. All 3 instances unambiguously refer to individual rights, not collective rights, that may be exercised only through participation in some corporate body," end quote. Later on, he adds, nowhere else in the Constitution does a right attributed to the people refer to anything other than an individual right, end quote. Failing to recognize the consistent use of the right of the people leads to the incorrect belief that the Second Amendment protects a collective right. Understanding the consistent use of the phrase reveals that the Second Amendment applies to individual citizens, just like we understand it to be for the First and Fourth Amendments. Cause number 3. Misunderstanding of the grammatical structure of the Second Amendment. Another source of confusion is the misunderstanding of the Second Amendment's grammatical and sentence structure. Without getting too deep into grammatical rules, the basics we need to understand is that the Second Amendment is grammatically composed of 2 parts, the prefatory clause and the operative clause. Some believe the prefatory clause, which contains a well-regulated militia, restricts the meaning of the operative clause, which contains the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. By understanding 18th century legal writings and established grammatical rules, we come to find the prefatory clauses are used to state a purpose, while operative clauses contain the actual rule. As stated in the book, A General Treatise on Statutes, their rules of construction and the proper boundaries of legislation and of judicial interpretation by Sir Fortunatus Duaris, published in 1875, quote, "It is nothing unusual in acts of parliament to go beyond the preamble. The remedy often extends beyond the particular act or mischief which first suggested the necessity of the law," end quote. As found in the D.C. v. Heller decision, quote, "The Second Amendment protects an individual right to possess a firearm unconnected with service in a militia. The amendment's prefatory clause announces a purpose but does not limit or expand the scope of the operative clause," end quote. Failing to understand this grammatical structure leads some people to believe that because the Second Amendment begins with the prefatory clause, a well-regulated militia, then everything that follows must apply exclusively to such militia, which leads to the collective rights interpretation, when in fact, the operative clause secures an individual right regardless of the prefatory clause. Given that nearly all the founding fathers were lawyers, they would have been well acquainted with the legal sources and documents of their time. So they would have been aware that the preamble would not limit the operative clause. Cause number 4, decline in civic and constitutional education. Most Americans are not taught Supreme Court cases that define the Second Amendment's modern constitutional meaning. A 2024 report from the U.S. Chamber Foundation found, quote, the survey finds more than 70% of Americans fail a basic civic literacy quiz, end quote. Without knowing the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and foundational rulings from the Supreme Court, citizens may not properly understand their own constitutional rights. Without the groundwork and guidance of landmark cases such as Heller, McDonald, and Bruin, citizens may not know the historical and legal background needed to properly understand the Second Amendment. Cause number 5. Media and political rhetoric distort the Second Amendment for partisan purposes. Media and politicians often oversimplify or misrepresent the Second Amendment to support political agendas. A 2024 article by Mark Harmon posted on the Tennessee Lookout titled, Words Matter in Tennessee's Debate Over Guns and Gun Laws, he says, quote, citing every part of the Second Amendment and not just the last is vital, end quote. He also adds, quote, we are long overdue to use more precise language about our national obsession with guns and our repugnant aversion to gun safety legislation. The biggest problem is the willingness by politicians and news outlets to echo the term Second Amendment when it is babbled by gun rights extremists, end quote. When reading the rest of the article, one can come to the conclusion that the author believes the right of the people was meant to be restricted and applied to militias, and that the individual right interpretation is wrong. He argues that people often leave out the beginning clause, which mentions the militias, and by doing so, change the meaning of the Second Amendment. Because the media shapes public opinion, repeated misinterpretation influences how millions of Americans understand their rights. Now that we understand the causes, we can look at realistic solutions to fix this problem. Reaffirming the individual rights interpretation of the Second Amendment requires educational and political reforms. Solution number 1. Schools should include constitutional literacy programs focusing on the Bill of Rights. In a 2023 report by the American Institute of Research titled Cultivating Civic Learning and Engaging in U.S. Schools, researchers mention, quote, although K through 12 schools are not the only institutions responsible for promoting civic learning, their role in educating the majority of young people in the U.S. gives them an opportunity to exert a significant influence in this area, end quote. If students learn what the Constitution actually says, they're less likely to believe misleading interpretations. Solution number 2, policymakers. So policymakers must base firearm legislation on Supreme Court precedent. The Supreme Court stated in NYSERPA v. Bruin that the Second Amendment related laws must be consistent with, quote, this nation's historical tradition of firearm regulations, end quote. They also added, quote, we know of no other constitutional right that an individual may exercise only after demonstrating to government some special need, end quote. Therefore, the Second Amendment should be treated by the courts with the same care and respect given to all the other amendments. Politicians must stop introducing unconstitutional gun laws that ignore existing precedent. In conclusion, we examined the widespread misunderstanding of the Second Amendment. Next, we discussed the historical, educational, and political causes behind this confusion. Finally, we considered solutions that can reaffirm the individual rights interpretation upheld multiple times by the Supreme Court. The U.S. government, courts, and educational institutions should reaffirm and teach that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms, regardless of militia service. Just like waking up one day to find that your rights have been redefined, misunderstanding the Second Amendment can slowly erase freedoms we take for granted. Clarifying and teaching its true meaning protects not just gun rights, but the integrity of the Constitution itself. Thank you.